Have you ever been asked to play a role that blurs the line between reality and desire? Imagine your boss, powerful, untouchable, and magnetic, leans close and says, "Pretend to be my fiancée." You think it's just an act, until his secrets begin to unravel, and you realize you've stepped into a world where love lies and loyalty collide. It was just another ordinary Monday morning in the towering glass building of Harrison and Cole Law Associates. The sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, catching the shimmer of polished marble floors and the metallic reflection of success that the company seemed to breathe. For Alina Brooks, it was routine. Coffee in hand, hair neatly tied, her desk perfectly organized. She had worked for Mr. Adrian Cole, one of the youngest and most influential millionaire lawyers in New York City, for nearly 3 years. He was known for his commanding voice, his cold efficiency, and a charm that never quite reached his eyes. But that morning, something about his demeanor was different. The air in his office felt heavier, charged, as if he was about to cross an invisible line that separated power from vulnerability. When he called her into his office, his tone was unusually soft, stripped of the usual authority. She noticed the faint tremor in his voice, the way his fingers tapped against the mahogany desk, and the faint shadow of exhaustion beneath his perfectly sculpted features. "Elena," he began, "I need a favor, a personal one." Those words alone sent a ripple of unease through her. Adrian Cole was not a man who asked for favors. He commanded, negotiated, and demanded. The very idea that he needed anything from someone else was shocking enough to make her heartbeat stumble. She tried to mask her curiosity with professionalism, straightening her blazer, her pen poised as though taking notes. "Of course, Mr. Cole," she said softly. "What kind of favor?" He looked up then, his blue-gray eyes piercing through her composure. "I need you to pretend to be my fiancé." The words hung in the air, unreal, absurd, almost laughable. For a moment, Elena thought she'd misheard him. She blinked, waiting for the smirk that usually followed one of his rare jokes. But none came. His expression was grave, his jaw tight, as though saying it had cost him more than he'd admit. "Excuse me," she whispered, her throat suddenly dry. "Did you just say?" He interrupted her softly but firmly. "Yes, I need you to act as my fiancée. Just for a few weeks." Her mind raced. She tried to find logic in his madness. Why her, why this? The office clock ticked louder, filling the silence as she stared at him, searching his face for explanation. "Is this some kind of publicity stunt?" she asked. "Or a corporate cover story?" He shook his head slowly. "No, this isn't for the firm. It's personal." His gaze drifted to the city skyline, where the light reflected off distant skyscrapers like shattered glass. "My grandfather is ill. He believes I've finally found someone to settle down with. He wants to meet her. He wants to see me happy before he—" His voice faltered, and for the first time since she'd met him, Adrian Cole looked human. Not the untouchable millionaire, not the ruthless attorney, just a man trying to hold together something fragile before it broke. Elena felt the ground shift beneath her. The request seemed simple on the surface, a harmless act of kindness for an ailing man's peace of mind. But something about Adrian's tone, the urgency behind his carefully controlled words, told her there was more. "Why me?" she finally asked, her voice quieter, almost trembling. "You could hire someone. There must be dozens of women who'd gladly play the part." He smiled then, but it wasn't the charming smile he used in boardrooms. It was tired. "Sad, because I trust you," he said simply, "and because I know you won't fall for the act." That last line stung in ways she didn't expect, as if he had already drawn invisible boundaries around their hearts before the game had even begun. That night, as Alina lay awake in her small apartment, her mind wouldn't stop replaying his words. She could still feel the weight of his gaze, the low timbre of his voice when he said, "Pretend." There was something deeper there, a shadow of truth hiding beneath the surface. She told herself it was harmless, just a role, just for a few weeks. Yet a small part of her couldn't shake the unease that lingered like smoke. Men like Adrian Cole didn't ask for favors. They calculated them. And if he needed her to play his fiancée, it wasn't just because of his grandfather. Something else, something darker, was hiding behind his composed exterior, something he wasn't ready to reveal. By the next morning, she found herself standing once again outside his office, her heart pounding. The papers were ready. The story had been drafted. They would be seen together at events, dinners, and charity galas. He had arranged everything, down to the diamond ring that glittered coldly in the light. As he slipped it onto her finger, a shiver ran down her spine. "Remember," he whispered, his breath brushing her ear. "It's all just pretend." But the look in his eyes told a different story. One of control, secrets, and unspoken emotions that no contract could define. And in that fleeting moment, as her heart raced faster than reason could follow, Alana knew her life had just been rewritten by 6 words she could never forget. Pretend to be my fiancé. The following week, Alana found herself stepping into a life she had only ever glimpsed from the outside. The life of the ultra, rich of whispered invitations and hidden power. It started with the clothes. A designer had been called to Mr. Cole's penthouse to take her measurements. Fabric she couldn't even name draped over her body. Silk that shimmered like moonlight, satin that breathed luxury. Every outfit was tailored to perfection, each accessory chosen to reflect her new identity, Adrian Cole's elegant fiancée. She stared at her reflection in the mirror and almost didn't recognize the woman staring back. Gone was the modest assistant who blended into the background. In her place stood someone polished, poised, and breathtaking. But behind the glittering exterior, her heart trembled with uncertainty. She was stepping into his world, a world where appearances ruled everything, and truth was just another accessory to hide behind. Their first public appearance together was at a charity gala in Manhattan. The venue shimmered with gold light, laughter, and champagne. Photographers lined the entrance, their flashes slicing through the evening air like lightning. As Adrian guided her out of the limousine, his hand rested gently on her lower back, steady and reassuring. He leaned in close and whispered, "Just smile, Elena. Everyone's watching." She obeyed, letting his calm confidence mask her nerves. The moment they stepped into the grand hall, conversations paused. Heads turned. The powerful and the privileged looked up, intrigued. The infamous Adrian Cole, the man who had sworn off love, had brought a fiancé. Elena played her role perfectly, just as he had taught her. She smiled, laughed at the right moments, and clung to his arm like someone who belonged there. But as she looked around the room, she couldn't ignore the eyes that followed them. Curious, envious, suspicious. Everyone seemed to want something from him. Business partners greeted him with flattering smiles that didn't reach their eyes. Elegant women watched Alina with thinly veiled disdain. She began to realize that in this world, affection was a performance, and every glance was a transaction. Love, trust, sincerity, they were luxuries even money couldn't buy. After hours of charming conversations and calculated poses for cameras, Adrian led her to the balcony overlooking the city. The noise from inside faded, replaced by the soft hum of the city below. "You did well tonight," he said, his voice low. "Better than I expected." She smiled faintly, unsure whether to take that as a compliment or a warning. "You make it look so easy," she murmured, staring at the skyline. "This life, this pretending." He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he sipped his drink, his gaze distant. "Pretending is how people survive here," he finally said. "Truth doesn't keep you safe. Power does." Those words stayed with her long after that night. As the days passed, Elena became part of a routine she hadn't chosen. Fitting sessions, press photos, dinners with clients who asked too many personal questions. Adrian's world revolved around image management. Every gesture, every smile, even the way she held his hand was strategic. The pressure was suffocating, but she couldn't deny the strange thrill that came with it. The expensive perfumes, the grand dinners, the luxury cars, they were intoxicating. Yet each night, when she returned to her suite in his penthouse, the glamour began to fade. The silence of that enormous place pressed down on her, a reminder that beneath the grandeur was something hollow. She began to notice small cracks in his perfect world. There were rooms in the penthouse he never entered, and one door that was always locked. He avoided personal questions, especially about his family. Sometimes in the middle of the night she'd hear him pacing in his study, his voice low as he spoke to someone over the phone, sharp, urgent, almost fearful. Once, she walked into the room without knocking and saw him hastily closing a laptop, his face pale, his jaw clenched. "Just work," he muttered, but the tension in his tone betrayed him. It wasn't work, it was something else. Even in public, she began to sense the weight of his secrets. At another event, a corporate dinner at the plaza, she noticed a man watching them from across the room. He was tall, dressed in black, his gaze fixed on Adrian with unnerving intensity. When she asked who he was, Adrian brushed it off with a tight smile. "Nobody important," he said. But later that night, as they left, she saw the same man following their car. When she turned to Adrian in alarm, he gripped her hand, his voice barely above a whisper. "Don't look back." From that night on, The line between illusion and danger blurred even further. The fake engagement that had started as a harmless charade now felt like a trap, an invisible net tightening around her. Every luxurious dinner, every sparkling jewel, every photo in the tabloids, they were all distractions, masks covering something much darker. And although Adrian continued to play the role of the confident, powerful millionaire, she began to see the exhaustion in his eyes, the fear he tried so hard to conceal. She told herself it was all part of the act, that she was simply fulfilling her promise. Yet somewhere deep inside, she knew the truth. She was no longer pretending just for him. She was pretending for herself too. Pretending that the glittering world around her wasn't made of lies, that the man holding her hand wasn't hiding something that could shatter both their lives. At first, Alina told herself it was all just part of the act. The gentle touches, the lingering glances, the way his voice softened when he said her name. Every smile she gave him was scripted, every laugh rehearsed. But over time, something began to shift, quietly and dangerously between them. The line between performance and reality blurred like a smudged reflection on glass. She found herself looking forward to the sound of his footsteps in the hallway, the low hum of his voice during late night briefings, the rare moments when his cold, calculating eyes melted into something human. Adrian Cole was a man who thrived on control. He planned every move, every word, every breath, or so she thought. But the longer she stayed by his side, the more she saw the cracks in his armor. There were moments when his composure slipped, when his eyes seemed lost in some distant memory. Once, during a dinner at the penthouse, she caught him staring out at the city lights, his expression unreadable. "Do you ever feel," he murmured without looking at her, "that the higher you climb, the lonelier it gets?" The question took her off guard. For the first time, she heard something in his voice that sounded like regret. "Yes," she admitted softly, "but I never thought someone like you would." He gave a faint smile, one that carried more sadness than charm. "Someone like me feels it most." The more time they spent together, the more their fake story started to feel real. There were spontaneous moments that hadn't been rehearsed. The way his hand brushed against hers when they reached for the same file. The spark that shot through her chest when he smiled genuinely, not for the cameras but for her. Once, they were trapped in an elevator for nearly 20 minutes, the longest 20 minutes of her life. In that silence, she heard his heartbeat, steady but quick, and when their eyes met, the air felt too heavy to breathe. "You don't have to be afraid," he said softly. "Off me, or any of this." But it wasn't fear that made her heart race. It was something far more dangerous. Soon, she began to notice small gestures that didn't fit the cold, distant image he showed the world. He started remembering her coffee order, black with 1 sugar. Something she'd mentioned once in passing. He'd opened doors for her, not out of obligation but instinct. One morning she arrived at work to find a small white rose on her desk. No note, no explanation. Just a simple bloom, delicate and pure. When she looked up, she caught him watching her from his office doorway, a faint, knowing smile on his lips. It was in those unspoken gestures that their connection deepened, subtle, fragile, but undeniably real. But along with affection came confusion. Every time she tried to understand him, he built another wall. She'd catch glimpses of warmth, only for him to pull away. He'd hold her close at a gala, his hand firm at her waist, his eyes locked on hers, and then, hours later, retreat into silence, buried in work as though nothing had happened. "Why do you keep doing that?" she asked him one night after a long event. "Doing what?" he replied, his tone guarded. "Letting me in, and then pushing me away." For a moment, his mask slipped completely. "Because I don't want you to get hurt," he said quietly. "Because the closer you get to me, the more dangerous this becomes." Those words echoed in her mind long after he left the room. Dangerous. She tried to dismiss it as metaphorical, but deep down she sensed there was truth in it, a truth he wasn't ready to share. Still, despite his warnings, she couldn't stop herself from falling. Love crept in silently, disguised as curiosity, compassion, and comfort. She started seeing beyond the suits, beyond the sharp words and business meetings. She saw the man who worked until dawn, who carried a loneliness that no fortune could cure. She saw a man haunted by something unseen, and all she wanted was to be the one who reached through his darkness. The pretending became harder to maintain. Every look felt too real, every word too heavy with emotion. The world believed they were in love, but what the world didn't know was that somewhere along the way, it had stopped being a lie. One evening, after a particularly long day, she found him sitting alone in the dimly lit study, his sleeves rolled up, his tie undone. He looked exhausted, not physically, but emotionally. She placed a hand on his shoulder. "You don't always have to be strong, Adrian," she said gently. He looked up at her then, his eyes filled with a pain she couldn't name. "I don't know how to be anything else," he whispered. That night, for the first time, he told her something about his past. Not everything, just fragments. A childhood marked by pressure, a father who valued power more than love, a betrayal that had shaped the man he became. He spoke in pieces like someone afraid to reveal too much. And though his words were brief, they were enough to make her understand why he built walls so high. "You don't have to keep pretending with me," she said softly, echoing his own words from before. He looked at her for a long moment, as if searching for something real in her eyes. "Maybe," he said finally, "you're the only one I can't lie to." That sentence, quiet, raw, and filled with truth, changed everything. From that moment on, she knew she was no longer acting. Whatever secret he was hiding, whatever danger loomed ahead, she was already in too deep. Their connection was no longer scripted. It was real, fragile, and terrifyingly beautiful. For weeks, Elena had sensed that something was wrong, that beneath the flawless image of Adrian Cole's perfect life, shadows moved unseen. The late-night phone calls, the guarded expressions, the men in dark suits who appeared at his office and disappeared without a word. They were fragments of a puzzle she couldn't yet solve. But one night, everything began to unravel. It was a Friday evening, long after midnight, when she woke to the faint sound of voices coming from downstairs in the penthouse. At first, she told herself to ignore it, that whatever he was doing was none of her business. But curiosity and something deeper than that, fear, pulled her out of bed. She padded quietly down the marble staircase, barefoot, her silk robe whispering against the floor. The voices grew clearer, Adrian's low, restrained tone and another man's voice, sharp and angry. She stopped near the study door, which was slightly ajar, and peered through the crack. Adrian stood by his desk, his jaw tight, his eyes burning with something she'd never seen in him before. Desperation. Across from him was the same man she had noticed at the gala weeks ago, the one who had watched them with such intensity. "You can't keep running from this," the man hissed. "You think money will protect you. You think your lies will stay buried forever." Adrian's voice was steady but cold. "If you touch her, I swear." The man cut him off with a bitter laugh. "Her? So, that's what this is about now, the fiancée? Does she even know who you really are?" Elena froze. Every word hit like a stone to the chest. "Who you really are." The phrase echoed in her head. The world tilted for a moment as realization sank in. There was more to Adrian Cole than the name on his office door, and the $1,000,000 smile that disarmed everyone around him. There was a truth he had buried deep, a truth that now threatened to surface. She couldn't hear everything after that, but she caught fragments, evidence, depth, what happened that night. Then silence, sharp, suffocating silence, followed by the sound of a door slamming. When Adrian finally emerged from the study, his face was pale, his expression unreadable. He didn't notice her at first, standing at the edge of the hallway, half in shadow. When he did, he froze. "Elena," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "What are you doing awake?" Her heart pounded in her chest. "Who was that?" she asked, her voice trembling. What did he mean? About who you really are? For a moment, he said nothing. The tension between them stretched thin, unbearable. Then he exhaled and walked toward her, his hands buried in his pockets. "You weren't supposed to hear that," he murmured. "Please, just go back upstairs." But she stood her ground. "No, not until you tell me the truth." Something inside him seemed to snap. The calm mask he always wore cracked, and beneath it was a man haunted by secrets too heavy to carry. "You want the truth," he said bitterly. "Fine. But you won't like it." He turned away from her, pacing the floor like a caged animal. "The name Adrian Cole isn't the one I was born with," he began. "It's the one I took after I walked away from everything. From a past I swore I'd bury forever." He paused, his voice breaking for the first time. "The man you saw tonight, his name is Marcus. He used to be my partner in a case that destroyed lives, a case that took someone innocent and made me rich." Elena stared at him, her mind spinning. "What do you mean?" she whispered. His eyes met hers, filled with guilt. "Before I built my firm, I worked on a lawsuit, a massive corporate fraud case. We won, we took down a rival company. But the truth is, we didn't win honestly. Marcus and I made a deal. Evidence was planted. Witnesses were paid. People lost everything, one of them. He stopped, swallowing hard. One of them was your father. The room went silent. The words slammed into her like a physical blow. My father. She repeated, her voice barely audible. He was destroyed by that case. He lost his job, his company. He took his own life. Her breath hitched as memories she had buried long ago came rushing back. Her mother's tears, the headlines, the whispers in the neighborhood. And now, standing before her, was the man responsible. Adrian's expression twisted with pain. I didn't know it was him, he said hoarsely. Not until years later. When I realized who you were, I tried to walk away, but I couldn't. I thought I could fix it somehow. I thought if I protected you, maybe I could make up for what I'd done. Tears welled in her eyes. So that's why you wanted me to pretend to be your fiancé, she said, the words trembling. To ease your guilt. To keep your secret safe. He took a step closer, desperation in his eyes. No, Alina. At first, maybe it was about redemption, but somewhere along the way it became real. I never meant to hurt you. I never wanted you to find out like this. She shook her head, unable to breathe. Everything, every moment, every kiss, every look, now felt tainted by betrayal. You used me, she whispered. You lied to me. He reached for her, but she stepped back, tears streaming down her face. Elena, please, he said, his voice cracking. I'm not that man anymore. But she couldn't hear him over the sound of her own heartbreak. The truth had shattered everything between them. The walls he had built to keep her safe had collapsed, and with them, the illusion of love they had created together. As she turned to leave, Adrian's voice stopped her one last time. They're coming for me, he said quietly. And now, they'll come for you too. Elena didn't remember how she made it out of the penthouse that night. Her body moved on instinct, her vision blurred with tears as she stumbled down the cold marble hallway. The city lights outside glimmered through the glass walls, mocking, distant, untouchable. The words Adrian had said kept echoing in her mind. One of them was your father. It felt like her entire world had collapsed in a single breath. Every moment she'd spent with him, every smile, every touch, every promise, now felt like a carefully constructed lie. The man she had fallen for, the man she had trusted, was the same one who had unknowingly destroyed her family's life. She spent the night walking aimlessly through the quiet streets of Manhattan, her heels in her hands, the night wind biting at her skin. Her heart battled with itself, love against fury, truth against denial. How could she still love the man who was the reason behind her pain? Yet, no matter how hard she tried to hate him, she couldn't forget the way he looked at her. The raw remorse in his eyes, the way his voice trembled when he confessed. He wasn't the same ruthless lawyer who once buried her father's legacy. He was a broken man, haunted by guilt and consumed by the ghosts of his own choices. When dawn finally broke, she sat alone on a park bench, watching the city come alive. She thought about her father, his laughter, his kindness, the way he had always told her that truth was the one thing worth living for. Truth. The word burned like fire in her chest. If she exposed Adrian, she could finally get justice for her father. She could bring everything he had built crashing down. The wealth, the fame, the empire built on deceit. But if she did that, she would also destroy the only man who had ever truly seen her, the man who had taught her that love wasn't about perfection, but forgiveness. The next evening, he came to find her. She hadn't expected him to. But when she saw him standing there at the park, under the dim glow of a streetlight, something inside her ached. His once impeccable suit was wrinkled, his eyes red, rimmed from sleeplessness. Elena, he said softly, taking a step closer. You disappeared. I didn't know if you were safe. She stood, her voice trembling but strong. You should have thought about that before you lied to me. His shoulders sagged, his pride stripped away. I never wanted to lie, he said quietly. But I knew that if I told you the truth, I'd lose you forever. There was a long silence between them, heavy and painful. You already have, she said. Her words were meant to hurt, but they came out broken, soaked in grief. He looked away, his jaw tight. I understand if you can't forgive me, he said. But please, don't let them use you to destroy what's left of me. There are people watching, Elena, people who want me gone. If they find out who you really are, they'll come after you too. That was when she realized the full extent of the danger. The case that had made him rich wasn't just corrupt, it was criminal. The men he'd worked with, including Marcus, weren't just lawyers, they were part of a larger network that thrived on blackmail, forged evidence, and silent threats. Adrian had tried to walk away, but the moment he did, they'd turned against him. And now, by standing beside him, even unknowingly, she had become part of his target. That night, Alina faced the hardest decision of her life. She could go to the authorities, expose the truth, and finally avenge her father's death. It was what she had dreamed of for years. Justice, truth, closure. But she also knew that doing so would destroy Adrian completely. It wouldn't just ruin his career. It could cost him his life. He was guilty, yes, but he was also trying to make things right. Could she condemn a man who was already drowning in his own remorse? She spent hours pacing her apartment, torn between the woman she had been raised to be and the woman love had turned her into. Her mind screamed for revenge, but her heart whispered of forgiveness. She remembered the softness in his voice when he told her she was the only one he couldn't lie to. And in that whisper of memory, she realized something painful yet undeniable. Love wasn't about justice. It was about understanding. The next morning, she went back to the penthouse. The security guards were gone, the doors slightly ajar. Inside, the air was heavy still. Adrian sat in his office surrounded by open files and crumpled papers. When he saw her, his eyes widened, not with relief, but disbelief. "You came back," he said, as if the words themselves were too good to believe. "Why?" She took a slow breath. "Because walking away doesn't erase the truth, and staying doesn't mean I forgive you. But I can't let you face this alone." His voice cracked when he said her name. "Elena, if you stay, you'll be dragged into this. It's not safe." She stepped closer, her gaze unwavering. "Neither of us are safe anymore. But I'm not here because it's safe. I'm here because it's real." For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, silently, he reached for her hand. The touch was hesitant, trembling as if he feared it would be the last time. Between them hung the unbearable truth that love had brought them together, and truth might be the very thing to tear them apart. Outside, the city moved on, cars honking, lights glowing, indifferent to the quiet war waging inside two hearts. Elena had made her choice. It wasn't the one her father would have wanted, nor the one justice demanded. It was the one love whispered for her to take. Fragile, dangerous, and heartbreakingly human. In the days that followed, everything changed. The illusion of glamour that had once surrounded their lives disappeared like fog at dawn. Adrian no longer attended lavish events or made public appearances. The newspapers had begun whispering rumors about hidden deals, missing evidence, and a possible investigation into his firm. Alina could feel the walls closing in around them, but strangely, she no longer cared about the world's perception. What mattered now wasn't the man the headlines painted. It was the one sitting across from her every morning, his face pale, his spirit fractured, and his heart stripped bare. Adrian was a man living in two worlds, one he had built on lies, and one he was trying desperately to rebuild on truth. Each day, she watched him wrestle with his past, determined to atone for the damage he had caused. He began working tirelessly, collecting documents, calling old contacts, piecing together the evidence that could expose the corruption he once helped hide. "If I go down," he said quietly one night, "I'm taking the right people with me this time." There was no arrogance in his tone anymore. No trace of the confident lawyer who once commanded courtrooms. There was only sincerity, and a heavy kind of peace that comes when a man stops running from himself. Alina stood by him through it all. Not out of obligation, but choice. There were nights when he would collapse from exhaustion, and she'd find him asleep on his desk, surrounded by files and cold coffee. She'd cover him with a blanket, her heart aching for the man who had once seemed invincible. She saw in him what few others ever had. Not power, not wealth, but the quiet courage to face the truth, even if it destroyed him. And in those moments, she realized something profound. Redemption wasn't about erasing the past. It was about owning it, and fighting to make something good out of the wreckage. One morning, Adrian handed her a sealed envelope. "If anything happens to me," he said, "take this to the authorities. It has everything, every name, every lie, every deal we made." She stared at him, tears filling her eyes. "Why are you telling me this?" He gave a faint smile. "Because I trust you more than I trust myself." The weight of those words pressed deep into her chest. He was giving her the power to destroy him, or to save him, and trusting her to make the right choice. But danger wasn't far behind. Marcus, the man who had confronted him that night, resurfaced, angrier than ever. He had caught wind of Adrian's plan to come clean, and he wasn't about to let it happen. One evening, as Elena returned to the penthouse, she noticed the door slightly open, the faint scent of gunpowder in the air. Panic surged through her. "Adrian," she called out, her voice shaking. There was no answer. Then she heard it, a muffled groan from the study. She ran inside and froze. Adrian was on the floor, bleeding from a wound in his shoulder, his phone shattered beside him. "Elena," he gasped, his voice hoarse, "get out of here. Now." But she didn't move. Instead, she fell to her knees, pressing her hands against the wound, tears streaming down her face. "I'm not leaving you," she whispered. "Not again." He looked at her, his eyes glazed with pain, yet filled with something pure, gratitude. "I told you it was dangerous," he managed to say. "I knew what I was risking." She held his face in her hands, trembling. "Then let's risk it together." Help arrived minutes later. The police, the ambulance. All because she had used the documents he gave her to expose everything. The network of corruption crumbled like glass, and with it, the lies that had once ruled Adrian's life. Marcus was arrested, and the truth about the fraud case made national headlines. Adrian's name was tarnished in the public eye, but for the first time in years, he didn't care. He had finally done the right thing. Weeks later, in the hospital, as sunlight streamed through the window, Adrian sat up, pale but alive. Elena sat beside him, her hand in his. "You could have left," he said quietly. "You should have." She smiled faintly, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "I thought about it," she admitted. "But I realized something. You didn't need someone to save you. You needed someone to remind you that you could still be saved." He looked at her for a long time, emotion flickering in his tired eyes. "You were supposed to be my pretend fiancé," he whispered, his lips curving into a small, broken smile. "And you were supposed to be just my boss," she replied softly. "But life doesn't always follow the script, does it?" They both laughed quietly. A sound fragile but real, like the first breath after a storm. In the weeks that followed, they rebuilt, not the fortune, not the reputation, but themselves. Adrian began working pro bono cases, using his skills to help those who had been wronged. He refused interviews, refused praise. Redemption, he believed, wasn't a performance. It was quiet work done in the shadows. Elena stood beside him through it all, not as his assistant or his pretend fiancé, but as the one person who had seen the darkness in him and chosen to stay. And though the world still whispered about the scandal, about the fall of the millionaire lawyer and the woman who stood by him, they no longer cared. Their story was no longer about lies, deception, or wealth. It was about truth, forgiveness, and the kind of love that rises from the ashes of ruin, fragile, flawed, but real. Months later, the storm had finally passed. The headlines faded, the whispers quieted, and the world moved on, as it always does. But for Elena and Adrian, life had slowed into something softer, something painfully beautiful. The chaos was gone, replaced by the rhythm of two people learning to breathe again, not as victims of the past, but as survivors of their own choices. There were days when silence filled their home, the kind of silence that speaks louder than words. On those days, Elena would find Adrian on the balcony, staring out at the skyline he once ruled. The city still glittered, but it no longer owned him. He'd turn to her with a faint smile and say, "You know, I used to think power was everything. Now I know, peace is." And she would smile back because she understood. Peace wasn't given, it was earned, through pain, through truth, through love that refused to surrender. One evening, as the sun melted into gold and the city hummed below, Adrian took her hand. "I don't deserve you," he whispered. She met his gaze, steady, certain. "Maybe not," she said softly, "but you've learned how to deserve yourself." There was no grand declaration, no fairy tale ending. Just two people, scarred but stronger, sitting in the quiet comfort of redemption. They never signed marriage papers. They never returned to the charade of pretending. But sometimes, when he brushed her hair from her face, or when she caught him watching her across the room, it felt like they didn't need to. Love didn't need a title. It didn't need a ring. It just needed truth, and that, finally, they both had. And so the story that began as a lie ended in something real. A woman who was forced to pretend became the reason a man learned to be honest. A millionaire who hid behind power found something far more valuable: forgiveness. And in a world obsessed with wealth and status, their love became a quiet rebellion, proof that sometimes the greatest redemption isn't found in winning, but in being brave enough to start over. Because in the end, it wasn't the pretend engagement that changed their lives. It was the real love that grew from it. A love that healed, redeemed, and whispered the truth both had long forgotten. Sometimes, the heart's truest vows are the ones never spoken, only lived.